Welcome to Blueprints of Disruption, a podcast that would love to dismantle the status quo. My name is Jessa McLean. It's only been a hot minute since Prime Minister Mark Carney took office, but he has wasted no time in pulling the Liberals further to the right. Transformative bills have been passed and a certain tone has been set. None of it is good. Luckily, I was able to team up with Ashwin from the International Solidarity podcast to get a much better handle on what he accurately describes as a paradigm shift. Ashwin provides some much needed context to the moves Carney's making both at home and abroad. We cover the legislation and commitments made in the first 100-ish days of this Liberal government in detail. We also talk a bit about the resistance mounting and the role of the left in the face of these changes. If you're not already listening to the International Solidarity podcast, you are missing out. We've cross-posted this episode over there. You'll see ways to find them linked in the show notes of this episode, along with a ton of resources and ways you can support our work. It's a longer than usual segment this week, so buckle up and let's just jump right into it.
Okay, hey Jessa, what are we talking about today?
Well, I think we're going to maybe spoil Carney's honeymoon a little bit
Mm,
because Carney's been in office for 100-ish days and it's been a reign of terror so far. And I think a lot of people aren't paying attention.
no, that's right. I mean, the wave that got Carney elected initially, right, was, initially the Conservatives were poised to win in December. Yeah, elbows up, huh? What happened to that? Yeah, no, the Conservatives were poised to win. A lot of people on the liberal progressive side of things, were very worried about it. The fallout of, Trudeau's leadership and all this. Mark Carney came to lead the Liberal Party. And it was relieving for a lot of people when he won instead of Pierre Poilievre, the prime ministership. But we're in the midst of summer. Yeah, according to the number of people that respond to my emails and texts, like people are very busy and are not paying as much attention. And I guess that's why we're here to sort of break things down, how this first bit of Carney's government has been. And much like, the first couple of days, weeks, and months of the Trump administration, where a lot of things were happening, a lot of things were coming out, um, it's the same in this case in Canada with the federal government.
It's not just the summer either, which is totally valid. I get it. I was at the beach this morning myself, but it's the fact that they're coming fast and furious. That became relevant as we're doing our notes, right? We started our notes maybe a week ago and we were just able to feed into them. And it was so much. It's like, who knows how much detail we can get into when we go over the various bills that he's passed, the promises he's made around military spending, his foreign policy or lack of it. Like there is a lot that he's been doing, and we've seen this style of politics before. I'm speaking from an Ontario perspective, but we can see it happening south of the border where it's just one thing after another. And it's really hard for activists to stay on top of all of the challenges, all of the ways that this is stepping back their work. And it becomes overwhelming, especially when we talk about Bill 5 is one of the bills a lot of people are really upset about. There's provincial counterparts there, right? So people are trying to fight all of these battles on so many fronts. And then, yes, a lot of it just gets lost in the shuffle because you have to prioritize something. But all of the things that we're going to unpack are equally as troubling and luckily have sparked resistance just as equally, right? Like there are people fighting back against all of the things. Bill 2 is on the agenda today. I've already mentioned Bill 5 and NATO spending, Palestine, obviously. But what bugs me the most
What?
is like how much I'm just a little itty bitty show, but we talk so much beforehand about this happening because if you look back at the leaders' debate, Carney used a lot of language. I pulled up my notes here where, building a Canadian economy, one Canadian economy, not 13, like forget indigenous economies. He didn't even recognize them in his land acknowledgement, right? It was a nation. Even in his land acknowledgement for the throne speech, right? He talked about getting things done at all costs or consultation, but with a purpose. And, there was no shortage of military hoo-ha and nationalism dripping from everyone's campaign. So I'm frustrated with how surprised some people are, but also thankful that they've fallen out of that mania, that Carney mania. They weren't just relieved, Ashwin. They were like celebrating, right? Like this was a victory of strategic voting. And now we have people openly acknowledging that Carney might be the most right-wing prime minister we've ever had.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I wanted to say was I really think, and maybe we'll know in retrospect, but I think this is sort of one of those moments where there's a paradigm shift, right? It happened, especially you can think of, the neoliberal era, the in Canada, the Jean Chrétien era where, it was a liberal government, but a lot of spending cuts, public expenditure cuts, winding down basically, the welfare state. You think of Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan in the UK and the US. In the Canadian context, you can think even before that, between the Diefenbaker era, into the Pearson era, was sort of a shift from this sort of British Commonwealth, small c conservatism to, trying to build a Canadian national identity, that kind of thing. I, I don't think it would be unreasonable to suggest that we might be seeing, a similar kind of shift taking place. And you mentioned how, right wing Carney is. I think that's part of the shift, right? That, I mean, the center is moving, has been moving to the right, and it's clearly continuing to do so. I understand why, folks might have been relieved that Pierre Poilievre was not elected prime minister and there's no conservative government. But two things. One, a lot of these bills that we're going to talk about today are passed with overwhelming support from the conservatives. And second, I mean, if this was a conservative government in place, sort of passing these bills, Bill C5, Bill C2, one would suspect there would be a lot more resistance to it. And just because it's a liberal government, uh, people are, able to sort of pigeonhole it, take it a little easier. It's a liberal government. They're not as scary. They're not as bad. I mean, that I think that's exactly what makes them just as scary. So if we want, I mean, Jessa, we can get into these bills, Bill C5 and Bill C2.
Let's do it. I think we were going to start off with Bill 5. It's probably got the most to talk about, although
There's a lot to talk about
Bill
for
2 doesn't disappoint either. I
yeah.
mean, but there's a lot of resistance stirring up for Bill 5. What did they call this? This is we were just talking about before we were recording that I think they've gotten less Orwellian with the names. Like we're at least told straight out with some of these titles exactly what they are, but this is the Free Trade and Labor Mobility in Canada Act. Okay, that's a little bit vague, but it includes the Building Canada Act.
Actually, Jessa,
And
I should say this is the name of this bill is quite ridiculous because it puts two bills together. So it's an
it
act
does.
to enact the free trade, etc. That first part of the bill and the Building Canada Act. Anyway, not that relevant, but it's a stupid name. But yeah,
Yeah, so it hits at that one of his biggest promises and that got a lot of traction because I think few people understood what it meant when he would eliminate interprovincial trade barriers. Red tape is another name that has given it to it, but that red tape is obviously more encompassing than provincial trade barriers. This is going to give the government the ability to bypass environmental assessments, to pay very little attention to First Nation consultations. Basically, anything they deem a national interest, red flag, is kind of free and clear. A minister can give it the green light when another project maybe wouldn't have. And they've been really explicit. He's talking about pipelines, ports. They include ports and whatever. I don't think anybody needs to ram through a port, last minute, but we're talking about pipelines. And again, like he made it clear that this was going to be his priority. And at the same time, you've got provinces enacting very similar acts. In fact, First Nations folks, 9 different First Nations have launched a legal battle against Ontario's Bill 5, just and Canada's Bill C5. And they passed almost around the same time. It was very hard to keep up with them. I thought I was mixing them up, and then I realized no, these are almost two identical bills that completely spit in the face of Indigenous sovereignty, amongst other things.
No, that's right. So this part of Bill C5 that you're talking about, um, by sort of centralizing power in the cabinet to bypass environmental regulations and indigenous self-determination or indigenous sovereignty. That is part of the second part of the bill, which is about building Canada. It's called the Building Canada Act. Okay, and like you're saying, Jessa, there have been comparable um, bills across the province. So that's why I'm saying, across the provinces, including Ontario, like you mentioned, BC as well has seems to have a similar kind of bill. I mean, this is sort of like a coordinated effort. Maybe I wanted to contextualize this a bit. Um, since it's so coordinated, it's worth sort of peering back and sort of investigating where that comes from. It also, thoughts are getting a little scattered here, but it's also very much related to what I was saying earlier about how this is sort of a moment of paradigm shift, right? All these governments are looking to centralize power, erode sort of democratic mechanisms of checks and balances, accountability, environmental assessments, indigenous sovereignty. Um, I think the root cause of this paradigm shift really is the paradigm shift coming with the Trump administration, right? The tariff regime that Trump was bringing forward. Um, and this reaction on the part of, I might be going on for a bit here, Jess, I'm sorry, but the reaction on the part of the Canadian federal government, but Canadian governments more broadly, is really a move to do two things that, in my understanding, right? To one, protect and bolster Canadian capital, right? Because it's Canadian capital or capital based in Canada that's threatened by these tariffs, right? And two, to capitulate as well to the US, right? I mean, and by capitulating, you also protect Canadian capital. Whereas the working class, right? The working class and indigenous nations, they're not even sort of in the equation. They can, they can get screwed. Um, but really, I mean, we mentioned that this bill has two parts, right? This bill C5. The first part is um, getting rid of interprovincial trade barriers, encouraging greater labor mobility across provinces in Canada. That's the first part. And the second part we talked about quite a bit, overriding environmental regulations and indigenous sovereignty. I mean, you can see these two things coming together in the same bill basically as a way to as an attempt to find new frontiers by capital to extract profit, right? If you're getting pushed on one side by the US, if you're getting squeezed on one side, well, what do you have to do? You have to open things up. You have to rejig things so that so that you can continue to extract, to exploit, reap profits. If not in the same way as before, even greater. And so, the frontiers here are the environment, indigenous sovereignty, self-determination. We can talk about the Arctic as well. Energy projects really seem to be at the center here. We'll talk about it a little more. Maybe one last thing I wanted to add on this was that when we talk about, Bill C5 in particular, trying to centralize power in the cabinet to approve projects deemed in the national interest. They're talking about the cabinet, right? But how, it's really worth zooming in here. That's right, right? It's just one person. I mean, it's really worth zooming in here to see how cabinet has functioned, especially throughout the Trudeau era, even before that, especially through the Trudeau era, and let's see if that changes. But things seem to suggest, right, when cabinet makes a decision, this is really coming from the top down, from the PMO. A lot of power has been centralized in the prime minister's office, and it's the prime minister, his chief of staff, a couple of other policymakers and staffers, really a room of five-ish, that can essentially deem this in the national interest and thus deem it in the interest of cabinet for cabinet to then sort of give the green light here. What happened to democracy, right? I mean, we talk about China and Russia being authoritarian states. I mean, what's going on here?
Well, and it's not like it's nefarious of the liberals either. That's by design. That's how cabinet's been designed in our Canadian parliament. Harper, we were famous on calling Harper a dictator because it was always known that like every single policy that came from that government just came from the PMO's office. And a lot of people don't know that. A lot of people, if you look at it on paper, it does look like it's a team meeting. I know we know backbenchers get no say, but sometimes the same is true of cabinet ministers. Not all cabinet ministers. Some of them clearly get input. Freeland is always in the mix, making critical decisions, but otherwise, yeah, it's very concentrated, and now it's concentrated in the hands of a banker that has a long history of ties to the US and its military industrial complex and the UK and some of the horrible reforms that went on there that benefited the most wealthy. So watching people celebrate, yeah, the banker coming in as if that wasn't a red flag in itself was something else. But I wanted to go back to something you said and the way you're helping to explain folks why these different frontiers are opening. But I feel like you framed it almost from like it's this economic necessity that I know you don't agree with, but just hear me out for a second. Perhaps all these threats of tariffs, although Trump has many, many reasons to behave this way that we could analyze, perhaps one of them is to allow these governments to make their own paradigm shifts, right? Like, because it was immediately as soon as the tariffs were suggested, BC NDP was one of the first to act. And they're like, okay, we're going to start pushing through pipelines that we previously were in negotiations with Indigenous people around and this and that. And I'm sorry, we've just got to greenlight them right now. But when we looked at them more deeply, they involved US investors. They involved a north to south pipeline that could only go to Alaska. And so it definitely wasn't kind of a insular thing. They were selling it as such, as a protection against Trump and his tariffs, but reality, it was facilitating US capital. So I think like Carney is not so much worried about these tariffs or Ford as they are looking at them, even if it is a threat to the economy and they have to scramble as such. I think they see this as opportunities to do things they've always wanted to do. Not like, just in case a listener thinks like, oh, well, they have to take from somewhere. What are we going to do? And it's like, well, this is just this kind of green light that they've been given because we consolidated around that too, right? The nationalism that we all bought up. When I say we, I don't mean me. Okay, but or I don't mean Ashwin either. But just generally, the Canadian public in that election was like Canada first, Canada first. And like that's always so dangerous because it leads to people rationalizing, well, if it's in the national interest and I hate Trump and I'm scared of China and Russia, then I'm sorry, Indigenous nations, you're just going to have to get along or not, right? So it sounds a bit conspiracy theory-esque, but I often think that that's why we can't explain Trump's tariffs, the way they go back and forth and they're used as leverage when they're already capitulating to him. Everything, right? When we talk about Bill C-2, that's another capitulation to Trump. So
Maybe before we get to Bill C-2, Jess, I maybe just wanted to build a little bit on what you're saying about um, you know, whether this is an economic necessity. And in the absolute sense, it's not an economic necessity. There are other ways to organize an economy, in in reaction to these Trump tariffs, right? In a more people-centered way that benefits the working class and works toward decolonization, ecological sustainability, et cetera, et cetera. I guess what I was trying to say, or was that it's an economic necessity for capital. This is, the capital wants to, as you're saying, they've had these plans. This is an opportunity. If they want to continue, not just making the same amount of profits, right? But like I
More.
said, more. It's more and more. It's crossing new frontiers.
Insatiable.
That's right. It's crossing new frontiers. This is sort of what they have to do, what they want to do. Um, the other thing I'll say on that about, you know, an economy geared toward capital and the capitalists versus an economy geared toward the people, the working classes, and the dispossessed, um, is, a lot of this language is about, we want to fast track infrastructure projects. We want to fast track, um, they talk about energy, but they talk about this more broadly as infrastructure projects. And I think it's worth highlighting here, as listeners might know, but that when they talk about infrastructure, they're not talking about people-centered infrastructure. I was in Toronto the other day, and I mean, if anyone walks underneath the
You
Gardner,
shouldn't, by the
and
way.
just
Wear a
looks
hard
up.
hat if you do.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, that infrastructure is eroding. It's
Literally.
horrible. I mean, a side note here, I came back from China not too long ago, and the infrastructure there is incredible. And when we talk about highways, when we talk about public transit, this is, people-centered infrastructure that, that benefits labor, that benefits the working class. This infrastructure that Carney talks about, and the rest of the Canadian ruling class talks about, is not that, right? It's particularly energy infrastructure, oil and gas, right? Fossil fuel energy, which notably, right, has high profit margins, right? So there's an incentive to keep to keep going at it with old energy, resisting transition to new energy because the profits are there. So when we talk about, pipelines, when we talk about, you mentioned ports, Jessa, ports are also important because, I was looking up, in preparation for this, some of these proposed projects, or, projects that are, maybe on the table, that some companies have in mind, that either have been proposed before, or, are, still in the works. A lot of these ports are, in the north, in the Arctic. Well, at least one in particular is in the Arctic North, in Nunavut. They want to, continue to develop the port of Churchill in Manitoba, and these are not just ports for port's sake. These are ports to, quote, get product to market, right? This is how, they want to extract more fossil fuel, produce energy out of it, and then, find new markets, and expand abroad, continue to reap profit. So bottom line here is, when they talk about infrastructure, it's not people-centered infrastructure. I mean, in this country, I could go on, but we need high-speed rail, we need public transit. There are, way too many cars. In the meantime, it might be nice to even just have, more electric cars, than gas guzzling cars. We can't even do that. But anyway, but that's people-centered infrastructure. This is not that.
No, and just to drive your point home, the bill coming out of BC from the NDP, so that was a victory for progressives over there, keep in mind. Back in May, they passed the Infrastructure Projects Act. So they're pretty clear, and they don't, this is energy driven resource extraction. That's exactly what they're talking about. And it gives ultimate authority, like you said, to a cabinet minister, and they have to use different language. Here we have, coming out of the provinces, it's not national interest, it's provincially significant project. So once somebody thinks it's provincially significant, and always, they mean the economy. They don't mean the people in the province. Because, like Carney told you this in the throne speech over and over again, right? His number one, the underlying priority was a strong Canadian economy. And we know a strong economy never means more for the working class. Our economy is predicated on, centralizing wealth and power uh, over and over again, increasingly. So BC went ahead and passed that. They were almost one of the first ones to pass it. And immediately it sent ripples through the environmentalist groups and First Nations that had been in negotiations with them, that had been trying to work with this BCNDP. And very strong statements came out against it, obviously. I'm not sure if there's any legal work going on. I imagine there is. And, they don't want to be outdone by the liberals, the federal liberals either. It was a back to back bill. It was 14 and 15. They both do almost the same thing as Bill 5 does, and Ontario again. Yeah, they have their own Bill 5, and it's all about removing barriers to development. And Grassy Narrows and other First Nations here in Ontario, they've been protesting out on Queen's Park since this bill was brought to second reading, at least. It's going to be such a blowback for First Nations groups, but also environmentalists. Like, one of the laws that it essentially does away with is the Endangered Species Act. And I know, like, maybe you're thinking, oh, some really rare bird I've never heard of might not make it. You may not understand the depth of that, what that act does for environmentalists. They're able to protect huge swaths of land by proving it will be a detriment to just one species. So it's proven as quite an effective tool to beat back development where capital is just knocking on the door, knocking on the door. And that's just gone and done. It's People can't believe it. That legislation's been around for so long. It's like almost one of those, like the Health Act. You just assume it's always going to be there. Nobody would ever do away with something like that. And, that just gives credit to Ashwin's theory there. Like this is all part of a massive paradigm shift. Do we have a name for it? You had labels for the other ones, and I was thinking,
I don't
do I
know.
want to know the
Yeah, we
name for
don't we
this
don't
one?
want to know.
Let's hope it's the death throes of
Let's
capitalism.
hope. I mean, that would be up to us. Yeah.
Yeah, we have to name it first, right?
Yeah, no, I
Or
was
they're
gonna say
gonna
that
give
would
it.
be the death throes of capitalism. That's up to the left to act on and to push.
I
That's what I meant. Yeah.
understand. Well, it's not sustainable though either.
Yeah,
Not that we can just sit back and wait for it to crash and burn, but this isn't a sustainable way to
it's
do
not.
anything, and they know it. But it's all like live for the now, stockpile your wealth, and those considerations. I mean, our politicians are notoriously bad of thinking long term, very short term vision. There's one challenge that I read when I was reading about the First Nations challenging both of those bills and the idea of national interest. And although they're making like constitutional challenges, like this is a threat to like very specific rights, they're also challenging the idea that national interest doesn't include Indigenous self-determination, right? Because it's very an arbitrary thing to say in someone's interest, in the nation's interest. Like, we aren't a homogenous group. What's good for one might not be good for the other. What's good for the economy definitely doesn't mean it's good for me. What's good for settlers is might not be good for indigenous people. So how we define that national interest should include, X, Y, and Z, amongst other things, like the protection of the environment should be in national interest. Is it? Probably not when they're defining these projects, right? So they want to ensure that First Nation self-determination is part of that discussion on what is in the best national interest. And I would argue that they're right? As stewards of the land for so long, but also if you were just talking about political stability, this isn't the way. But I'm not here for political stability. So that's, you piss off more people, we've got more ready with nothing to lose. I get that, but I just thought that was an interesting way to then challenge that national interest or provincially significant. Are you going to say it out loud that definitely does not include Indigenous rights? Be prepared to say that out loud then, because that's essentially what they're doing. So
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, Bill 2 is another one of these very concerning bills. If a conservative government was passing a bill to someone, I had read in an article that this would be, Stephen Harper's dream to pass a bill like this. I mean, whether that's true or not, Bill 2 is a, a very concerning bill. It's called the Strong Borders Act, or at least it's colloquially called the Strong Borders Act. Very Trumpian language there. Um, I mean, that's enough to to concern people.
Well, this one's kind of like a two-parter too. Not officially. I imagine it is broken down into chapters. We'll link the actual bills, so you don't have to take our word on any of this. You can read it for yourself. But a lot of folks came out against it as a mass deportation bill. It's an anti-migrant bill. I mean, I say they came out as rightfully so, factually so. It is, but it also raises huge concerns over mass surveillance. So I guess like let's break it down in that way. First, it was one of Carney's first bills. And I think that's why it made it so alarming because we were in the throes of watching the ICE raids, or we still are, uh, early days. But we knew it was coming and it was going to get ugly. And then here we are, the Canadian bleeding heart liberals, and their first priority was to pass something that was going to make it even harder for people to seek asylum coming through the United States. There's a lot of things wrong with that bill, but just that alone should get you really riled up. The fact that we should have done away with a safe third party agreement with the United States long ago. I've said it a million times on our show. Amnesty International has been calling for that agreement to be fixed or scrapped for years, long before internment camps for migrants. Okay, like long before that, we knew it was not safe. But now it's almost nearly impossible to come through the United States and claim asylum in Canada. And I'm here to shit on Carney, but this is a continuation of Trudeau's policies, right? That still today see 3,000 people lose their status in Canada every single day right now, right? And migrant rights warned us that 1 million people would eventually lose their status in Canada because of the changes the Liberals made, which means they've got to leave or they've got to stay undocumented. And this feeds into that even more. So now the minister, again, a consolidation of power here in another department. The minister of immigration holds incredible power here, not just on single cases. You know how we appeal to them to do the right thing, to not deport environmental activists, blah, blah, blah. And we can make it case by case. But now they can make sweeping changes to immigration policies that would essentially mass deport groups of people, say from a certain country or with certain criteria. Who knows what doors that opens? And that goes on the books for any government to use down the road, as do all these things, right? If you're like, oh, but it's just the Liberals using it, they're going to use this to build wind farms and just stop fentanyl from crossing the border. That's not true. But, either way, these are things that will now become Canadian, right? What it means to be Canadian is to essentially turn migrants away. And I feel so bad for migrant rights groups because at the beginning of Trudeau's reign, he promised them status for all, right? He promised that he would roll out that, and he did for some groups. There were some gains made, and then there was just this shift. And it was step back, scapegoating them for housing, this, that, and the other thing. And it's just been a completely different story for migrants in Canada. And that's just part of that bill.
Yeah, no, I mean, you're totally right about this, Jessa. One thing I maybe wanted to pick up on was how this is sort of a continuation of sort of the, the tail end of Trudeau's time as Prime Minister, Trudeau's government, this noticeable kind of shift in the attitude toward migrants. I mean, let's not forget, I mean, during COVID, when we needed migrant workers, we allowed international students and others to work longer hours, right? So, I mean, the basis of the Canadian economy, the fundamental sectors, think of food services, think of trucking, meat packing, all this kind of stuff, industrial work. All of this is, done by migrant labor of one sort of or another. I can't forget food production as well, right? Agricultural goods, etc. Coming back to how this is sort of a continuation of the Trudeau legacy, I would say it is, and it's also not, right? Because on one side, it is sort of continuing the legacy of turning against migrants for a country that, boasts its, migration and multicultural credentials. But it's also, I would say, different in the sense that this is really, a reaction to, again, the Trump regime. Whereas Trudeau's, right, was in the dying days of the Trudeau Liberal government, where the Liberals were polling very low, and the Conservatives were gaining ground on questions of immigration. I mean, you saw this also on social media. A lot of the proliferation of a lot more anti-immigrant, anti-South Asian as well kind of sentiment. The Conservatives were capitalizing on this. The Liberals under Trudeau thought they could undercut the Conservatives, by repositioning. I'm sure there were economic considerations as well that drove that policy forward. This is really, I mean, a huge step
Backward, backward.
backward. I mean, a huge step backward in terms of uh, uh, you know, what I'm trying to say is that it's a big step from Trudeau's immigration policy, cracking down a lot harder. And I think the move here really is to, again, capitulate to the US to protect, to shield, quote unquote Canadian interests to some extent, read, Canadian capital, to shield them to some extent, by capitulating.
You've definitely got a point. Like it's definitely hit a different speed and a different tone, and Carney set that tone. Like Trudeau did it with a smiling face and did try to pretend it was solely about fentanyl. But we also have to remember that Trump isn't the beginning of the anti-migrant, the detention, the deportations either. These were pressures the US had been leaning on us probably for some time. And it's not just led to us spending a lot of money at the border, which Trudeau made sure that we were promised to do. On top of that, we were leasing US Black Hawk helicopters to do it. So we're just like, they are very intertwined. You'll know this when you cross the border, especially at an airport, right? We've got US Customs here at our airports, and the way border services work together, which kind of ties into the rest of this bill, is very tied with US, right? Like these agencies work very closely together for years. So I love this. At the same time, he's trying to pretend that we've got to do everything possible, strip everyone's rights to protect ourselves from the US. But at the same time, when it comes to our border or the military spending, it's just like we're good. It's like there's no threat at all to do this, to have our border services intertwined like that, and to give the US even more power to intrude on Canadian rights. Right? Like the second part of this bill is it's surveillance, and it gives enhanced powers to CSIS, to the folks that check the mail when it comes across the border, and telecom companies.
To the police as well.
Yeah, like it gives US companies the ability to make requests of service providers here in Canada that essentially give them warrantless access to whose databases we're on and who knows what else, right?
At this point in the bill, what the bill seems to be suggesting is it's going to give Canadian law enforcement that power, but at least at this point as it stands, it leaves the door open for data sharing and things like that with the US. So, at least at this point, it seems like that's not in the bill, but it leaves the door open, and that's sort of the point.
It does leave the door open, but it also includes protection for service providers should they provide more than what they were mandated to do. So it's almost like they've told these
Right.
service providers, like, you give the cops whatever they ask for. You give too much, we won't ever punish you for that. Because obviously they've been in negotiation with these telecom companies, right? What they're capable of doing and whatnot. So they'll hand over your whole file.
The way that this is different from the Trudeau era is that it is sort of reacting to the Trump regime in a way that it's trying to harmonize, because, borders and immigration and so-called crime is such a big deal to Trump. Uh, in trade negotiations, etc. This is something seen by the Carney government as something to move on, to come to a better agreement. One of Canada's, I guess, chips, negotiating chips. But the move here is really to integrate, or at least it seems to be to integrate our sort of immigration law enforcement systems, such that you if the U.S. was once talking about annexing Canada, right, and taking over Canadian sovereignty, the provisions for greater surveillance in this bill really sort of moves in that same direction, at least in terms of information sovereignty, right? Data sovereignty. It leaves the door open for the US to effectively have some level of sovereignty over Canadian residents' data. So I mean, so much for elbows up, right, and standing up to the US.
And securing our sovereignty. That was a word thrown around a whole lot, even when they were giving like land acknowledgments. It was, yeah, he's a complete contradiction, Carney. Although he did spell it out, the narratives he's using to justify all of this flip from one end to the other. There's no consistency, but there's also not a lot of pushback going. Like, that's a thing when you allow a party to get a new leader too, and then everyone tried so hard to get him elected. So there's got to be this kind of grace period that not only do they give new leaders just to see how it all shapes out, like give them the benefit of the doubt, but it's also for their saving face as well. Like, how fast can you then turn around and start complaining about the man you told your neighbors to all go vote for, right? So, yeah, there's this deep, deep contradictions that just seem so obvious to everybody who's paying attention. But that's the key word, like who's paying attention. Bill C2 did, though, mobilize a lot of people. I'm looking at a letter here signed by acknowledging that 300 different organizations demanded a complete withdrawal of Bill C2. And it's a who's who of migrant rights, civil liberties groups, labor organizations. Obviously, I can't read them all, but I'll link that letter from openmedia.org. And it's incredible that it was the very first bill, but probably the least amount of controversy over. I think a lot of people are talking more about NATO and the promised military spending, perhaps, than they are the actual bills that have been passed. And you kind of mentioned it earlier, but it's hard when there's legislation like this and he's going to reign this way because although, 7 seats is not a lot for the NDP and you do have the bloc there, this is legislation that the majority of MPs will just be gleeful to pass, and challenging through the electoral system, I think, is going to be a bit of a lost cause for people under Carney's reign. So, I mean, everything we've talked about requires a lot of spending. These infrastructure projects and the surveillance and border security, and we're going to get into military spending. All of this is going to lead to massive austerity as well. I like that wasn't in our summary of points to get to, but I think it's an important to note that even, your parliamentary budget officer has come out and said, like, whoa, you're going to have massive cuts to the public sector in order to accomplish this. And sure enough, Carney has issued orders that we saw Rob Ford give, really go to every single department except for the D&D, right? Except for the military, and say, cut 10 to 15% of your budget. I don't give a shit where you get it. I don't care what the social impact is. I don't care. Just you cut that budget because we've got to spend on war and tax cuts, but a lot on war. I think you safe to go into that one now.
Yeah, no, I was gonna say that. I mean, that transitions quite well into, this, commitment made by Canada and all NATO members at the recent NATO summit that happened last month at the end of June, where members, committed to military spending of 5% of GDP annually, by 2035 in Canada's case. So, I
That's
mean, just to
crazy.
give it's insane. Just to give some context, right? The target, for the past, you know, I think it's been several decades, is to get to 2% of GDP. All NATO members should be spending 2% of their GDP on so-called defense military spending is better put.
Yeah.
Canada has never attained that 2%, mostly because previous governments have known that it would be suicide to do that. You'd have to cut from elsewhere, and who knows what that might trigger in terms of public reaction, um, that kind of thing. So far, I mean, I should say, even Stephen Harper's government is on the record saying, that that's not possible. We're not going to be able to do that. So far, I mean, I think in recent years, it's been at about 1.4 something, 1.45% of GDP. Canadian GDP is on military spending. Trudeau was pushed on this, I forget how long it was ago, several years ago, when he went to the White House to meet Trump, to bring it up to 2%. Now they're talking about 5%, and that would come to, $150 billion in military spending per year. That's what that translates to. 5% of GDP is $150 billion in military spending. Just to put that in context, I think, there was so much outcry about, a couple of years ago about, the Trudeau government purchasing the Trans Mountain pipeline. And I believe, if I'm not wrong, I might be getting this wrong, the price of the pipeline at that time was, I'm remembering, it was either 4 billion or 7 billion. Either way, now today I know that, as the costs have added up, that pipeline is sits at about $34 billion. Okay, so that was outrageous
Pocket
to
change
people.
now.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, that was outrageous to people, rightfully so, back then. I mean, we're talking about, like what? This is four, more than four times that amount, $150 billion per year. Anyway, I could go on, but yeah, that's insane.
Well, I mean, we will let you go on. I want to go back to that 2%, um, and the fact that we hadn't met those commitments. And obviously, I'm going to work in a way to shit on the NDP. I'm sorry if you don't allow swearing on your show.
No, no,
um,
it's all good. I do.
but I had Eve Ongler on, and this was one of his sticking points, the fact that there's nobody even challenging that narrative at all. Although you say, most people are under the assumption or the knowledge that it's political suicide, no good for the economy, massive austerity would be required. That's really not what the NDP said when Carney starts talking about 5%. What did they say? They chastised the cons and the liberals for never making the 2% commitment, for failing to meet previous commitments. So it doesn't even close to challenging the concept of NATO. I don't know if we have time to unpack that. Maybe you do. Maybe you could fire through forget whether or not we could afford it. The whole concept of NATO is a problem, but even if you shelf that, you have the most progressive political option out there going, well, you should have spent 2 years. If you had spent 2% every year for the last 25 years, we wouldn't be at this shortfall. And it's like, oh, good. Well, NATO would be really robust, but our social services would be gone. That just doesn't even come out of them anymore. So that pissed me off, and I thought it was worth noting because we talk about resistance too to all of these things, and none of it is coming out of the legislature really. You talk about they undermine the conservatives by we did this first. Now you'll never be able to take credit for it, and Lord knows what your next campaign is going to ask for that we haven't given you already. But at the same time, we don't really have anybody challenging it on the other side either. So that becomes troubling. And that 150 billion that Ashwin quoted per year is not even close to the total military spending Carney has either promised or suggested is a possibility, right? So he is giving the US, and I feel like with my kids, if I say maybe, they know it's a yes, because you don't say maybe and then say no. I feel that's mean. It's like, I'm going to just tease you with it. So my son will even be like, oh, I know that's a yes. And I'm like, damn, I buy myself some time. And that's all that it is. So when Carney says that his participation in the Golden Dome, which is think of the Iron Dome for Israel. If I have to explain that to you, you're on the wrong show, but, but for the US, and again, we're talking about Arctic sovereignty as well. This is a big protection from Russia and China, and it's going to cost billions upon billions. He says that's a possibility. We might get into that. that means he is. He's already committed to rearm Europe plan. And then you have to they've he spent 6 billion before he even had the election too, right? Before he was our legitimate prime minister. I love feeding into those con points a little bit, like, but he spent $6 billion on like radar systems for the Arctic. So this man is just like throwing money at war, weapons, surveillance, radars, missiles. And that's your liberals. I think that's what's the most scary. Like people are like, "Oh, this can't be bad. It's the liberals." But like, no, that's how bad Canadian politics has gotten. These are your liberals doing this. I don't how can we imagine what would be worse from the cons? I really don't understand. Now I'm scared. Like when the cons come in, do they feel like they've got to outdo this guy?
I'm sure. I'm
No.
sure.
We'll
Um,
build the Golden Dome ourselves. We'll make it in Canada, and then that'll be at least the F-35s. That was Jagmeet's solution, right? The F-35s. No, we shouldn't be buying American F-35s. We'll build our
it's
own.
crazy.
Thanks.
Um, yeah, no, I mean, your point about, okay, where do the conservatives then go from here? I think that's sort of the point, right? The liberals are sort of simultaneously, I mean, they're seizing on this moment to outdo their opposition, to undercut them, right? I mean, you know, i- if the liberals become the conservatives and still maintain the aesthetic signifiers of what it means to be a liberal, you take away the conservatives' ammunition, right? And they have less sort of political clout to run on. Um, in terms of the Golden Dome, I mean, you know, uh, how's the Iron Dome going for Israel? Did it protect Israel against, missile barrages from Iran? Last I checked, you still had, Israelis running into their bunkers, getting hit, all this kind of stuff. Yeah, the Golden Dome. I mean, there's too much to say there.
It makes sense if you know who's there to make money off
Yeah,
it,
yeah.
right?
No,
Like
no,
the
exactly.
folks
That's right.
behind it are Peter Thiel, and he's connected to Carney, and I think we'll just have to have Ashley on to come and explain all of those connections. But it's a banker making his banker buddies a lot of money. One note that I did want to add that helps kind of make sense of some of these connections, like why are we elbows up, but then giving the U.S. military money, or the companies that make their weapons money. Carney spent a lot of his time convincing Canadian pensions to heavily invest in the US weapons manufacturing industry. And so, yes, although that is good for the Canadian economy because our pensions are well funded because they're war hawks and they're always at war, obviously we understand the problem with that, right? So, again, a banker with bankers' interests, we don't know what he's invested in. Pierre always has me feeding into his lines like that, like, but it's true, right? Like he has fiscal interests that aren't yours, that won't make sense, like, or to your parents, like they're like, why would they do that? Right? Like, why would they do that? That can't be good for us. I'm like, no, but they don't act in your best interest, right? Like, I don't know. Most people listening probably realize that, but I know you're talking to people that were like, well, that just doesn't make any sense, like, why would Carney do that? And there's lots of
Yeah,
reasons.
I mean,
But yeah,
the whole Golden Dome thing. I mean, you're so right. I think this was sort of pitched by Lockheed Martin, right? The Golden Dome idea. I mean, people talk about Indians and Nigerians as being scammers, right? Known for scams, online scams, phone scams. The biggest scam is Western civilization. You have these people just, it's making up things left, right, and center. It doesn't matter if you have the Atlantic Ocean on one side of your protected continental island and the Pacific Ocean on the other side. You need a Golden Dome because we need to make money off of it. Trust me, guys, just trust me. It's crazy.
it sounds cool, right? Like people get sold on it.
Yeah.
Ooh, but yeah, you build up that environment of fear too, where we're constantly looking at each other sideways. That feeds into folks thinking that's justified. The whole Arctic threat, though, they've been playing on that for quite some time, being able to spend a lot of money up there, trying to protect it. Meanwhile, not even going into discussions, legitimate discussions on indigenous sovereignty up there. That's always going to be that contradiction. But that Russia red baiting China constant threat, no matter what, right, has us obviously looking in the wrong directions. Not to be a Putin stan, but I mean, it just has us not looking at capital
Yeah, that's right.
as the real threat first and foremost. It's always got to like it's external, and that makes us come together as a family, as a nation. Yay! When there's an external threat, an other, and they just can't decide who that other is. Is the United States? Sometimes it's Russia. Sometimes it's China. It's never Israel.
Yeah. I mean, we've looked at, well, how sort of insane of a plan this is to get to 5% of GDP on military spending. Let's maybe, uncover a little bit like why is this happening? Again, coming back to this thing about the paradigm shift, right? You have NATO commitment spending 5% on GDP. Canada has to spend 5% of GDP on military spending. You have maybe the Golden Dome. I'd be surprised if it happens, but that you have Canada joining hands with Europe, signing strategic partnership agreements in terms of defense, this kind of thing. What explains this? What is happening? You mentioned Russia and China. I mean, in Canada, that's used as the excuse to expand northward, to recolonize the north. Turn our military attention to the north. Um, that as if Russia would ever pose a threat to Canada and the United States. Um, these are not Russia and China are not military threats to the West. This is sort of a NATO talking point, right? As if NATO is a defensive organization. That's the assumption in this, right? NATO is a defensive organization. Russia and China are, aggressors. Every as many have learned during, the genocide and Israel's behavior, in the whole region. What is it? Every confession isn't no. Every every accusation is an admission or a confession, right? NATO here is the one that's the offensive organization. It is not a defensive organization. If it was a defensive organization, it would have disbanded when the Soviet Union collapsed. Okay, I mean that's now they're talking about forming an Asian NATO, heading eastward to encircle China. Anyway, Russia,
Anyway,
Russia.
that's just a side note for now.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, there would be a lot to say on that. But Russia and China are not military threats to Canada and the US. And when we talk about military threats to Canada, we're largely, that's the question of threatening the US. I mean, the US is, if Canada is attacked in any kind of way, the US steps in. I mean, no matter how much antagonism Carney and Trump pretend to have against each other. But Russia and China, and especially China, are economic threats to the West and to Canada, and uh, so how should we see these sort of increases in military spending? This greater posture toward quote unquote defense. It's because China and the global South are developing themselves, are undergoing processes of economic development that pose a threat to the West, to the global North, right? For centuries, the West has actively underdeveloped the rest of the world by extracting resources, labor, and wealth from them, right? The West is only developed today because it stole from the rest of the world and, of course, indigenous peoples on this continent. Again, coming back to the point about how Western civilization is really a scam. I mean, they steal from you and ask you why you're so poor, why you're underdeveloped. If you're indigenous, why are you so lazy? Yeah, a lot to say there. Um, but now that they're finally being challenged on the economic terrain, right? China, especially on the part of the global South, is really redirecting its wealth not outward toward the global North and to the West, but reinvesting that wealth, into its own country, uh, to pursue economic development. And if you look at any Chinese city, you can see that this is true. Um, this threatens the West, and if the West can't economically compete, which it won't, right? Because that involves cutting into their profits, that involves potentially, reinvesting in research and development. They don't want to do that. Reinvesting in their
Heaven
people,
forbid.
yeah, heaven forbid. They don't want to do that. What they're good at, what they've been good at is violence, is military coercion, and it also so happens that the war economy is profitable. So naturally, the easiest thing to do is to pour more money into the military, into so-called defense, to be offensive and to act as to act to deter these powers. I think in an article that I was reading, it was exactly those words that Mark Carney had used at the at the NATO summit, to in describing these spending increases, that these increases in spending will act as deterrents against so-called aggressors, Russia and China. So that's really what explains this. I
Aggressors.
mean, I should maybe shout out the hyper-imperialism dossier that was put out by the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. I mean, this is really, they've looked into this, they've looked into the numbers. A lot of this is their argument about how when the West cannot compete economically with China, what do you turn to? You turn to military solutions. And if you look at the history of the West, that's essentially what it is. You lead with military coercion, with violent coercion, and then you economically subordinate to the other. They did that on this continent in North America. They have been doing that around the world through colonialism, neocolonialism, etc.
It's a scary thought to think like that that's what's motivating folks to spend, our tax dollars on, especially when we won't benefit from that competitive edge all that much. You know what I mean? And all these solutions are always just an attack on somebody else's working class, right? Rather than a lot of the solutions, even that we suggested in response to the tariffs down south too, were just like damaging to workers down there, and uh, always lacked this class analysis on it, on what these bills mean, and our reaction. But like hearing you call China, I know you're being facetious, obviously, the aggressor, while Trump talks about taking us over. And I just wonder who that's selling with. Who is buying those lines? Like, I'm appreciative Ashwin's able to kind of explain why, because there's people going like, why? None of this makes sense. Because I think they don't see Russia as an aggressor. Not to them. I mean, maybe to Ukraine. I can get people looking at that. But China, I think that's becoming harder and harder for people to do, especially with the exposure that we can get now from China and seeing how they live, and what we've naturally been told. So it's easier to see them as that economic threat as opposed to a military one. But it's just, I think, again, drives home that point that Carney is really playing into US hegemony and US capital needs. And that goes the same with his foreign policy that we've seen him take in a very short time, like 3 months, 3+ months. He's been there, and he's given us every reason to believe he's going to be a war hawk himself, or green light any kind of military intervention abroad. During the election, I think Carney had, maybe not Carney himself, but the Liberals did a good job of trying to rebrand themselves on Palestine a little bit. They had some MPs start to walk a little better of a line. It's still lacking. And they even managed to get not endorsements, but some favor with folks for calling for a ceasefire. And then when Carney was elected, again, one of the first things he did, besides Bill 2, was sign a joint letter with Keir Starmer, of all people, the Prime Minister of the UK, and Macron in France. And it was a condemnation of Israel of sorts. I mean, we could always write a better one, right, Ashwin? But it was a lot better than we had ever gotten from the Canadian government. And it was with those two other global powers that had previously been so horrible. On the point, like totally, completely facilitating, including the use of military jets. Like, we all know that they're aiding in this genocide in more ways than one. So everyone, that was like, I talked to Alex Neve, he used to run Amnesty Canada, and like human rights activists and Palestinians, they saw that, oh, ooh, this is a much better position than we ever got out of Trudeau. There's hope there. But then within 3 weeks, they watched him going into the G7, going, are they going to say something? What are they going to say about Palestine? Are they going to say something? Like, let's build on that letter. And they got nothing, crickets. Uh, but then it got worse. Like a week later, he sits down with Christiane Amanpour, and he tells us that, yeah, he believes the Palestinians deserve their own state as long as it's a Zionist one. And I think that was just like a real gut punch for people who hadn't seen Carney for what he was at that point. And then it got worse. Like it was Iran and Israel go back and forth. And we're like, surely he's going to condemn these attacks on Iranian infrastructure and leadership. And nope, just only condemned Iran. And then today he's asked, or yesterday, July 16th, he's asked specifically about Israel now bombing the hell out of Damascus, including shots right next to the presidential palace. And he reiterates, I asked Ashwin, what do you think he said? What do you think he said? Like which cookie cutter response did he come out with? And you were a little gracious, Ashwin. I'm outing you now. You're like, oh, it's going to be I'm very concerned of the loss of civilian life, but something. Not even that. It was like full Zionist talking points. Israel has the right to defend itself. That was it. That's what we're getting out of him. So I can't imagine a conservative PM being any worse on foreign policy in this moment. Do you? Like, I mean, I could get worse. We have imaginations, but
I think things can, in fact, always get worse theoretically. But what I did want to come back to was the whole thing about the Zionist Palestinian state, or Carney calling for a Zionist state of Palestine. I mean, I think this is where it's important for folks um to sort of understand the strategy here and sort of the strategic desires of Global Affairs Canada, of the Canadian government, of the PMO, right? When Carney signs a letter with uh you know uh, with the British government and the French government, um and is calling for a ceasefire, these kinds of things, I think it's important to not get disillusioned with the spirit of what those demands are, right? I can see, right, that those are those moves that might be perceived as more quote unquote positive can be totally compatible with this statement of having a Zionist Palestinian state. I mean, the whole idea of the two-state solution in the first place, the implication was that the Palestinian state had to be a Zionist state that would, quote unquote, live in peace with Israel, et cetera, affirm Israel's right to exist, et cetera. But I mean, really, the move here is they're looking out for the strategic interest of Israel and the strategic interest of the West and the connection between Israel and the West, right? Um, you know, uh, let's have some more aid in so that it doesn't get so bad for Israel, so that public opinion doesn't turn on Israel as much. The Zionist Palestinian state, let's do that right now. I mean, even I think there was talk in May of both the British and French governments looking to unilaterally recognize a Palestinian state diplomatically, right? And I think Israel, according to reports, behind closed doors, really push back against that. But I think the move there on the part of the British and French governments um, is to sort of preempt Israel and say, hey, it's either this or collapse. It's either this or imminent collapse, and you sort of have to save yourself, and you have to save yourself for us as well, right? Like the question of Israel is not a question of just Israel. It's a question of the collective West. So coming back to the bottom line here, when Carney talks about a ceasefire, when he talks about we're concerned about civilians in Gaza, when we need to let more aid in, and on the other side of things, we need to have a Zionist Palestinian state. He's actually talking about the same thing. These things are all needed in the view of the West collectively, so that Israel has
Legitimacy.
longer to survive. Yeah, legitimacy. Otherwise, I mean, people have been doing some work on this, sort of tracking this. I think of Shir Hever, who's been on the Electronic Intifada, an Israeli political economist, looking at how Israel, both economically and within the military apparatus itself, has been taking hits and it's been attrition for them, so it's in the interest of the West to sort of keep the buoyancy of Israel, if even if it means a Palestinian state, which Israel, especially under the current regime in Israel, would be completely opposed to.
I read reports this morning that Canada is almost openly working with UN members to thwart the establishment of a Palestinian state. Because they'll tell us one thing and then do another. Because right now, a Palestinian state wouldn't be defined as a Zionist state, right? Like if they got to decide what their state looked like and had self-determination, chances are it would not be a Zionist one. So yeah, that's a crafting that the West will have to do, right? They're the only ones that can legitimately form new states, right? In the very specific parameters they have set for them.
Just like they did 100 years ago with the British Mandate of Palestine and the formation of Israel, etc.
And the foundation of Canada. People often wonder why we're having such a bad take. It's an identity crisis for a lot of Canadians, I think, who saw themselves as peacekeepers, right? They were still stuck on that imagery. But you've helped explain, just one of the angles, the foundation, really, but monetary as well. Carney will look you in the face and say that we do have an arms embargo with Israel. And meanwhile, the Maple reports that, well, actually, they're reporting on a global affairs report. So this isn't like some independent investigation. Like the government also knows this is public information, but yet they'll still look at us and say, what do you want us to do? We cut off arms. Well, no, Canadian companies just in 2024 alone sold almost $20 million worth of weapons right to the IOF. That we don't even know how much they sold to the United States with the explicit purpose of going directly to Israel. That's a loophole that exists. We've talked about before. It's not ever going to be addressed by the current government. They love that loophole exists. But they did at least try to pretend that they wouldn't put any permits through on Canadian companies, and even that they didn't even bother stop. So, we saw Carney confronted on the campaign and, will you call it a genocide? No, I won't call it a genocide. Will you stop selling arms to Israel? Oh, we already did. And that label of genocide that we refuse to give it as well, it just speaks to our history, right? Like it helps explain like our history is very similar to the establishment of Israel. And so every condemnation we make of them is an admission, right? Just it works both ways, that all these things that from the apartheid conditions to the ethnic cleansing, this is not anything that's unfamiliar. And in fact, still is the basis of legitimacy for the Canadian government. And so like geopolitical reasons, economic reasons, and then just like domestic political reasons or, legitimacy reasons for the Canadian state itself. So we can understand from a financial perspective why they act like they act, but when we've seen what we've seen, it's really hard to understand why, again, our bleeding heart liberals of Canada don't have a better position on this, but not maybe when you unpack it. Hopefully the way that we're trying to unpack it for folks. I do want to make note that, because it really did piss me off, and I can see caps locks through my notes, so I gotta just remind folks, you've seen the videos, you've heard the noise. $2.8 million worth of arms that I mentioned before were directly under the category of aircraft and aerial drones. So Canadian companies are actively making the weapons that you see the carnage unfold. And on top of that, right, we have a free trade agreement with Israel still. Some people are like, what? And it's like, yeah, no, we still have, forget sanctions. We have a free trade agreement with Israel. And that's something Carney won't address either. So
I wanted to talk a little bit about the emergency conference on Palestine. Are we good to move to that?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I wanted to talk about this because it's, not been getting as much attention, but July 15th and 16th, this year, which was yesterday and the day before, as of time of recording, an emergency conference on Palestine took place in Bogota, Colombia, which basically convened the Hague Group. This was organized by, what's known as the Hague Group. This is a group of a number of countries, largely almost exclusively from the global south. Just to name some, that includes Bolivia, Cuba, Colombia, Indonesia, Iraq, Libya, Malaysia, Namibia, Nicaragua, Oman, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, South Africa, and others. I listed all of them because I think it's also important to sort of to get a sense of who these countries are. Like, why are they there in the first place? You can see a country like Malaysia has, obviously a Muslim country, but throughout this genocide, they've been, the population has been extremely vocal on the issue of Palestine. The Malaysian government has been vocal on international and diplomatic platforms about this. If I'm not wrong, I think a number of Western multinational food brands like KFC, McDonald's, Starbucks, may not be those ones exactly, but in that kind, had to pull out of Malaysia, or we're losing great amount of money because of boycotts there. So that's just one example. You can think of Cuba as having their own politics they bring to the question of Palestine. But this was an emergency conference on Palestine to sort of end the impunity that Israel has been having to carry out this genocide in Gaza, but also wreaking havoc across the region, being an aggressor, and to uphold international law. And they've these countries, the Hague Group, they've come out with 6 measures, concrete measures that are going to be adopted by each of these countries in their own domestic legal and administrative systems. So, I mean, and I'll go into what these 6 measures are. I would say, you know, there are several reasons why we should pay attention to this. One, because these 6 measures are things that those of us on the left here in Canada can pay attention to, and globally, can pay attention to echo these demands to our governments, right? This is happening on a diplomatic level. There are real countries in this real world that have convened this real conference.
It is possible.
It is possible, and it is the task of the left in that case to echo this, particularly because I've looked at Canadian media, the CBC, CTV, Global, all of these. None of them have reported on this emergency conference, and again, that sort of just speaks to the how Western media more broadly has been, to say the least, complicit in this genocide, right? And has the effect of sort of obscuring uh, measures that are being taken globally, right, to put an end to this, and to hold Israel and the U.S., particularly Israel, to account for this. So yeah, I mean, this is a model for us. I'll just go into some of the 6 measures. I think it's important to read it out. So I will. One. So these have been adopted, and sorry, I should say, by the way, they have extended this call to other countries to join as well. They've given the deadline of 20th September this year. So, around 2 months for other countries to join in and to adopt this program as well. Um, Another reason this is so significant is because, these are global South countries, right? These are small countries. Think of Namibia, right? Again, the politics of Namibia coming to the table. They, I think it was last year, stood up to the Germans saying, how dare you have anything to say about the question of anti-Semitism or genocide, when you are the ones that have committed the genocide in Namibia, erstwhile German Southwest Africa, I believe, against the Nama and Herero people, right? Millions of people killed by the Germans in that genocide. So that's the sort of attitude that the Namibian government and the Namibian political class brings to a conference like this. So this is a historic conference of the Global South. Okay, I will now read the 6 measures after long delay. One, to prevent the provision or transfer of arms, munition, military fuel, related military equipment, and dual use items to Israel. Two, prevent the transit, docking, and servicing of vessels at any port, if applicable, within our territorial jurisdiction. 3, prevent the carriage of arms, munitions, military fuel, related military equipment, and dual-use items to Israel on vessels bearing our flag. 4, commence an urgent review of all public contracts in order to prevent public institutions and public funds, where applicable, from supporting Israel's illegal occupation of the Palestinian territory. 5, comply with our obligations to ensure accountability for the most serious crimes under international law through robust, impartial, and independent investigations and prosecutions at national or international levels. 6, support universal jurisdiction mandates as and where applicable in our legal constitutional frameworks and judiciaries to ensure justice for all victims and the prevention of future crimes in the occupied Palestine territory. This is ultimately a legal approach, right? An approach to international law that's being taken by diplomats, from states from the global south. This is not, revolution. This is not going to stop the genocide tomorrow. Nonetheless, this will go down in history as, a step taken in favor of humanity at the global international law level when, many have, abdicated their responsibility. There are also questions of power, right? How is the global South going to stand up to these imperialists, right? Conducting a genocide.
And how will they be
That's
punished?
right. Yeah, exactly. That's right. And so even more, historic that these global South countries are coming together at a diplomatic level to bring this forward.
I just want to make note, you can go back and look at the show notes and see, we'll link this letter and these measures so you can reread them. Or you can rewind and listen again. But, measures 1 through 3 all talk about basically preventing arms and goods going to Israel. And although absolutely at a government level, this is their responsibility, but it can be done without their help. Labor could do 1 through 3 all by themselves. All by themselves. You wouldn't even need one non-unionized person if you could just, and port workers are notorious. It's not that unions aren't. Oakland is a great example. They have been able to prevent or delay ships there through action. And in Spain, port workers have refused to load cargo going to Israel without the government having to pass anything. So, when we're talking about our approaches and the responsibilities of the Canadian left, yes, we can go to Carney and ask him to do the right thing, but I think we've given you ample evidence that he's not going to, right? So, some of these can be accomplished through direct action and labor organizing. Another note, number 5 talks about complying with our obligations of international law, even on a domestic level. And people are taking steps to, again, make that happen kind of without the government's help. The Maple has published a website that documents anybody living in Canada that has essentially bragged about going over and being a part of the genocide, being part of the IOF. Ideally, this database will be used down the road to persecute these folks. We do have it under our laws, the ability to do that. I'm not for the law and order approach. However, people are taking steps to kind of do this on their own because they've lost hope in the Canadian government doing some of these. And then some of them, you absolutely need the state's help or where it falls completely under their jurisdiction. One of the comments I saw, most people are very excited by this letter. It's shocking to see this many countries take these measures one day. We wish they had done it months ago. There's always something that could be better, but one of the comments that I thought was somewhat justified, especially when we talk about the billions of dollars that Canada will be spending on military, it would have nice to see a commitment to physically stopping the genocide. Because we talk about, let's say NATO is a defensive group. It's not, right? But if they are, why aren't they doing anything? Right? We know why. We've unpacked it, why it's not actually a puzzle. But the idea that collectively across the globe, we spend an unfathomable amount of money on weapons, preparing soldiers for this, that, and the other thing, and even doing military interventions when our economy can benefit from it. I have no problem sending soldiers somewhere else and even defying international law and orders, right? But even in this circumstances, all of this money that will be taken from like the social safety net, not one of it will be put to protecting the people of Gaza or actually upholding international law. I think so. That is the biggest proof you need to like, will NATO do good things with that money? No, they will not. They could have, and they never did. They've had ample opportunity, these states included. I mean, I see Libya on there. I don't think they have a functioning government at the moment. People might wonder why Yemen's not on there because Yemen's government doesn't actually support Palestine. It's the Houthi rebels that do. Some of these nations have other resources other than the more passive kind of actions that they are proposing, right? Like it's like we will not help them anymore, right? We'll make sure weapons don't get there. We'll make sure any criminals that do it, only the last one talks about preventing, but it's kind of reliant on universal, like international law and the global community doing it first. And that's just not happening. So I'm not a tanky, I don't know, people might call me that or an excellent, but at some point you have to wonder like, why do you spend all that money then if it's not to stop a genocide? Right? The whole premise of the UN was predicated and created on the fact that never again, right? Never let a genocide happen again. So I don't understand how Canadians could greenlight this kind of spending, knowing when we had a chance to do the right thing, we didn't. Yeah, we kind of got sidetracked. It's not all about Carney, right? Like, although we
Yeah.
can demonize, and that's the danger of leadership cults too, right? Like this episode will be labeled Carney. We might even use his imagery on the cover art. Who knows, right? But the idea that it's just like him and his mission, or Trump and his mission, that's not very helpful. I use that language sometimes because it helps tell the story, but
The representatives.
the
Yeah.
representatives, people kind of look at you funny when you say capital with a capital C, right? They're like, oh,
Yeah.
you're one of those. Those commies. They think everything's, all business is bad. And,
Yeah.
but that is the reality, right? Like these are the plans that predated both of those folks. But, Carney at least is going to face our ire. He is the representative of all of this. So I don't discourage people from trying to hold them accountable and stopping Carney in his tracks if you could. However, I think maybe using your energy towards enacting some of these measures, whether you're talking about Palestine or you're talking about indigenous sovereignty, I think you're going to have to think a little bit out of the box to make sure that pipelines don't go through land that it's not supposed to go through. I don't think a petition's going to cut it.
On that note, Jessa, I was thinking if we're thinking of closing out, I have a question for you.
Uh-oh.
Um, no, I just want to ask you, what do you think is sort of the through line then, between all of these things that we've discussed today? We discussed Bill C5, Bill C2, just, to recap, that's, on, plowing through energy infrastructure projects, cracking down at the border, enhancing, surveillance, spending on military, right? Continuing to support the Israeli regime. What's the through line here? And then, what are the tasks then? What does our discussion today reveal about the tasks of the left in Canada? At this juncture where I argue there's a paradigm shift. Like, what are the tasks? What are our tasks?
I think like part of that paradigm shift that you talked about, and we haven't used the word yet, is fascism. I think capitalism, like as I said, is not sustainable and it's going through stages. And we joked, but it is essentially the death throes of capitalism where they have been forced to take all of their masks off. But unfortunately, that's also freed them up to do some really shocking moves, right? That I think they wouldn't have gotten away with, say, 8 years ago. And it's a time to, secure the state's its monopoly on the use of violence. That military spending, that border spending, that RCMP spending, it's not just for external purposes either. Although we didn't talk about it, Carney was really eager to enact a federal bubble law, right? And so I think the powers that be understand that there is discontent growing amongst the masses, and they're going to have to take steps to be a more strong-armed version of capitalism. And that will, of course, require mounting a defense against the people. So they're doing it legally. right? That's the consolidation of power, allows for that to happen a lot faster and without recourse or oversight. And so they're it's also normalizing that, like normalize it against migrants, normalize it at the border where we're all afraid, normalize it in foreign policy where we don't really understand. And again, there's really bad actors out there that they can kind of justify it with, but all of that will then be also applied to us when we can't take that austerity that's coming, that hyper capitalism that's coming. The Fraser Institute tries to, we kind of left that in our notes, but one of their concerns about Bill 5 was that it does consolidate power in the cabinet, but how do we know they will take capital's interests? How do we know we should be central? Like they're saying it out loud and clear that fine, you can consolidate power, but it should be with us. And Carney believes that to be true. We know from the folks he hangs around with uh, just what he shared with us that he absolutely believes in scapegoating as a means to secure power and all the other things that go along with eventual fascism. You most people will picture Hitler as that figure, but let's replace like that madman figure with just like that more of a Mr. Burns vibe, right? Like it's because you can't really understand Hitler because it was so awful and it was just like the way that we've learned that story, it seems unfathomable. Same with the genocide in Gaza, like if you just try to understand it like that. But if you understand it as just like the consolidation of wealth and the richer wanting to get richer, you can understand that, right I think people get that, and we're getting there, right? They can't possibly get away with what they're getting away with anymore. And so we're coming up with this, yeah, I don't know what the label will be, but it's like strong arm capitalism. Like we've gone through vampire capitalism already, but now I mean, when you get strong arm capitalism, you really do by definition of almost have fascism.
Yes, very important point about how, as this goes on, as the sort of decay continues, they're going to have to, I mean, this is not the 60s anymore. You don't have a post-war boom, where you can give little treats here and there to the working class in the global north and the west to buy them off. Wealth is being concentrated further and further upward to the elites, to the 1%. There's less to go around for the working class, for for everyone else, migrants, indigenous nations. Um, so naturally, what do you have to resort to? You have to resort to more violence. And the stability of the regime, the Canadian regime, the American regime, all these regimes in the West, is increasingly, as you're saying, Jessa, going to be upheld through violence. We see that, violence and centralization. We see that with Bill C2, greater surveillance, right? Like this is important. It's not violence directly, but it's part of that process of coercion, right? If to increase your leverage and violence, you need to have something on them, and that's where data collection and surveillance comes in, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one through line that I really appreciated. The other thing I maybe want to highlight is this whole time we're talking about indigenous nations and indigenous sovereignty. When we talked about NATO, we're talking about the imperialist sort of offensive against the rest of the world, um, underdevelopment of the rest of the world, and sort of now reacting to the global South trying to develop itself. There's a direct connection, I should say, between Canada's need to continue to dispossess indigenous nations within the borders that Canada claims, including, with this Bill C5 trying to, uh, you know, override environmental regulations, override indigenous sovereignty, trying to mine more for critical minerals, all this kind of stuff on indigenous land that's, going to, pollute their land, pollute, harm ecosystems. There's a connection between all of that on, the harms that Canadian capital causes to indigenous nations. And then on the other hand, to the offensive imperialist campaign that Canada and the rest of the West takes against the rest of the world. I mean, after all, right? Like the connection between what you can call the third world or the global south and indigenous nations, quote unquote, within Canada, or at least within the borders that Canada claims. This is a connection that goes back, since the beginning of colonialism, right? They expanded to the rest of the world, to the global south. They expanded to North America and some of the other settler colonies, genocided the populations, etc. That this contradiction, this dynamic, this relationship between indigenous nations here and the underdevelopment imposed on the rest of the global south, that continues to be something that, as capital looks for more frontiers, they're going to push against those two frontiers as well. That's something I wanted to highlight. The other thing I wanted to highlight, at least in terms of the tasks for the left, is, well, if this is a paradigm shift, right? It's not going to come without ruffling some feathers, right? Uh, um, Canada is a project that needs to be held together. This has always been the case. I mean, as the Bloc Québécois leader said recently, that Canada is an artificial country with very little meaning, held together by not so much, something along those lines. Very good quote. I mean, it might offend some people that Canada is not quote unquote a real country. I mean, but an important way to think about it is that it is a project, right? It's a project that needs to be held together. It has always been so.
Statescraft, right?
That's
It
right. That's
it
right.
takes effort.
This is not the nation state model that, evolved in Europe, where, the French people of France get a French nation, and a French state and the English, etc. That doesn't quite apply to Canada or the United States. Um, so it needs to be held together. And, they've, even if you go back, I recently learned that Engels, I think Frederick Engels had visited North America and at around the 1900s or just before that. And he wrote something where it was like, surely this, Canada is going to eventually be absorbed into the United States, which I found hilarious. I mean, but that, just shows how long that contradiction between Canada and the US, has been, and how Canada has sort of been trying to resist factionalizing and break up and to hold these things together. Quebec, now you have Alberta. Do we not think this move by the Carney government to bolster sort of energy capital in particular, or oil and gas capital in particular, has nothing to do with the rising sort of sovereignist sentiment in Alberta? This is an attempt to hold things together, right? So I think this is a very useful way to view things, because it also shows where things can be pushed, right? Where left movements and others in coalition can push, right? Do we think that greater energy and infrastructure projects getting quote unquote product to market is not going to ruffle feathers in Quebec? There was, there's long been a talk of the Energy East pipeline that would send some kind of fossil fuel, I forget what it was, from Alberta, from the west through Quebec and to out east to the Atlantic, to export to new markets. Quebec was heavily opposed to that, and it never happened. This is, so, and of course, on the part of Indigenous nations, it's great to see that there are already nine First Nations in Ontario, or that are asking for um, these new bills, especially particularly Bill C5 and Bill 5 at the provincial level, to be declared unconstitutional. This is something that's going to continue, and the task of the left, at least in my humble view, is to get on board with this, to identify the shifts that are taking place, and to respond to them. View Canada as a project that is not this absolute thing. It is contingent. It is contingent on being held together by different forces, and those forces can be disrupted, as Jessa would say.
Well, because some people listening might think, pragmatically speaking, holding the country together is a good thing, right? Like, I feel like that's another episode altogether on why, why statescraft is a bad thing, why nation building, for the most part, is detrimental to the working class. But some people don't see it that way, right? Still, right? Like that is important to the economy, for our sovereignty. If we all start infighting, we'll lose ourselves to the United States. But when you look at it, absolutely it's going to ruffle feathers. I think it's a cost balance sheet for them, right? What feathers can they handle? What can they legislate away? What protests can they just subdue? I think that the purpose of the left now, or the task of the left, one of them is to back Indigenous sovereignty, be there for land defenders, make sure these legal challenges are highlighted and supported, but also like support land back, support Indigenous sovereignty. We have almost lost at the electoral level. I mean, there's really no strong voice there or strong motion that's going to happen. Like, no politician will save us from the resource extraction that's going to be mobilized. And we can't just leave it to land defenders, as we always do, who are protecting our waterways and our land, right? And the land we all depend on. So support Indigenous movements. If that's not already part of your organizing, all you Marxist groups out there, if you're not addressing land back or Indigenous sovereignty, you are missing a massive tool in the chest of preventing capital from doing whatever they want to do. And the other thing is to diversify your tactics. You already hearing me over and over encouraging you to spend less energy in the electoral sphere. And everyone has a different role to play, and some will take more risks than others. And like, that's not for judgment. Everyone's in a different position to play that different role, and that's okay. There's lots of mutual aid behind the barricades. You know what I mean? Like, it's not just about being violent or, physically standing up to the iron fist of fascism. But for some, it will be. And I think you have to, those who that is uncomfortable with, folks who are preaching nonviolence, no matter what, that can be your strategy. I get that. And like, we can have an argument about the effectiveness of that, and that's fine. But, you're going to have to leave space for the anarchists. I think we need to grow a little bit more in what our idea is of the right way to resist. There's going to be a lot of people resisting in different ways, and like, not to condemn anybody, to understand that no matter what stage we go through, whether it's like hyper capitalism completely unchecked or revolution, both will be very difficult. Neither of them are going to be good times. I hate to say that, right? Like, but that's why we build up the networks of mutual aid and support at the same time that we fight the resistance, so that we can kind of like carry each other through that really difficult period. And at the same time, all of those networks we're creating, they will be like the birthplaces of something new, right? Because we've learned how to do it better and cooperate on more effective levels and take care of one another outside of the capitalist system and all of that. So, it's a mix of getting ready for the ugly, both physically, like materially, and mentally. And that could be hard because it already feels like shit, right? A lot of people are already in a dark place. We're witnessing a genocide. We're broke. Politics suck. COVID exists. And we're overwhelmed. So the idea of like pushing it to a point where it might get worse before it gets better is really hard for people to grasp. But either way, it's going to get more difficult, right? It's just like where you're going to choose to put your energy and your support. I think this was a helpful discussion. I think not only did, we highlight some of the things that people might be missing about what Carney's doing, but we offered alternatives as well, right? Like, it's not like we're saying that the threat of Trump's tariffs don't exist, or all these other situations don't exist for Carney to be able to respond to, but we're telling you he is responding in all the wrong ways that, build up our so-called enemies and placate not just to Trump, right? We've put a name and a face to it, but to capital in general. And again, I'm at a loss as to explain why anybody can possibly be surprised why Carney would do that, other than maybe they fell for his biography. I think if anybody read the book, it was like drinking the Kool-Aid.
Yeah.
I mean, I think now maybe they've stepped away and people can look back and see this and going, uh-oh, we kind of stepped in it. And I mean, to be fair, they didn't really have any other choice. It's not like and blaming people for choosing Carney over Pierre Poilievre. Like, no, 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 don't. I'm not cheering for conservatives, but it really bothered just how gleeful everybody was about it. And I just wanted to steal a little bit of that joy that you might have had that we didn't win that election. There's still a lot of work to do, and we really can't wait to do it.
Nice. I think, as you would say, Jessa, that's a wrap on Blueprints of Disruption and the International Solidarity Pod.
Blueprints of Disruption is an independent production operated cooperatively. You can follow us on Twitter at BP of Disruption. If you'd like to help us continue disrupting the status quo, please share our content, and if you have the means, consider becoming a patron. Not only does our support come from the progressive community, so does our content. So reach out to us and let us know what or who we should be amplifying. So until next time, keep disrupting.